Thank you so much for being here. My name is Joy Mayer, and I am the director of Trusting News, which is a program designed to figure out as much as we can about how people decide what news to trust and train journalists to demonstrate credibility and actively earn trust, which involves showing up with humility, understanding what we do that contributes to mistrust, understanding the misassumptions that drive mistrust, and developing strategies to work earning trust into our day-to-day routines. I'm thrilled that there was so much interest in this conversation because I too am very interested in this conversation. I've been excited to do it for a long time. And let me tell you what we're going to talk about today and then introduce the person I'm so excited to talk to. So we talk a lot at Trusting News with newsrooms who are frustrated by people who it seems like don't exist in the same reality, don't exist on the playing field of facts. Sometimes are spewing a bunch of hate-filled remarks back at the newsrooms, spewing a bunch of ignorance back at newsrooms. And journalists would like to figure out who is actually persuadable when it comes to the credibility of news. We at Trusting News assume that not everybody is reachable. We say all the time, there are some people who are not going to believe us no matter what we do, and that's not who we're here to worry about. There are a lot of other people who consume news more casually or might not be quite as married to their perceptions of news and who are absolutely part of the audience I think we should be trying to reach. So we are not here today to provide strict guidelines and rules about who is reachable and not reachable, but we would like very much to grapple with this conversation. And there's no one I would rather grapple more with this conversation than Amanda. Hello, Amanda.
Hi, Joy. Hi, everyone. So good to be here with you.
So quick bio of Amanda. She's an investigative journalist and host of a great Slate podcast called How To. She's also the co-founder of Good Conflict, which is a company that creates workshops and content to help people get smarter about how they fight, which is a fascinating concept to me. Her most recent book is High Conflict. And you guys, seriously, it's so underlined. I was reviewing my favorite parts again this morning. High Conflict, Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out. Like many of you, I was introduced to Amanda's work through an essay she wrote in 2018 called Complicating the Narratives, which really shaped a lot about how I see the world, honestly. And it's language that I adopt all the time in my family and my work. Let's complicate that view, shall we? And I really do think that we would all be better off if we would complicate our views. So I'm excited to dig in. Shall we dig in?
I think we absolutely should dig in. And I'll stop. Like, I'm just seeing all these names and I feel like I want to be like, hi.
I know. I want to say hello to everyone too.
I say hi to all of you. Hello.
So I am going to, Amanda and I are going to talk for part of this time and then open it up. We left this as a meeting format, not a webinar format, so that we could have a conversation. So please do stick comments and questions in the chat anytime. So, Amanda, let's start with this. How can we make sense of different realities that people live in? There is a difference between people who just see the world differently from us and people who don't accept facts that we hold dear. There's a difference between people who are deeply committed to kind of a false reality and maybe so committed to that not believing us is part of their identity. But that's not everyone who doesn't believe us, right? There are plenty of people who hold their skepticism of us more loosely or who are more casually and who would be more open to what we would like to share. So how can we tell the difference? How do we make sense of the realities people are living in?
Well, I love that you said grappling with, because I think this is going to be a full on wrestling with hard questions. And I just will start by saying, I don't know the answer, and neither do you, right, Joy? I mean, these are hard questions. So I'm excited to hear from everyone here. I know there's a lot of wisdom and experience in the Zoom room. So that's my sweeping caveat. I guess I think about a lot this problem in two ways. Like, on the one hand, as a journalist, I totally feel this. Like, you cannot give up. I mean, you cannot reach all people. Like, especially now, it's just getting really, really hard. And there's a whole bunch of people who don't want you to reach them, to your point. And it's hard enough. Like, it's hard enough, right? So I totally feel I'm on board. But then I have this problem, which is, I spent the last like 7 years hanging out with people who do conflict differently than journalists, like mediators and peacekeepers and gang violence interrupters. And it's really a bummer because, and some of them are here. I see Mary. It's a bummer because what they will tell you is, it's not great to give up on people. Not saying you don't have boundaries, right? Not saying you don't have accountability, but giving up on people is generally not recommended unless you want the conflict to get worse. Okay. So what do we mean though by giving up on people, right? I think it's really important to back up and say, what is our goal? And who is it we're talking about potentially giving up on, right? So if our goal in a given story, and I think I wish I had done this, like I'm not saying that I used to do this, but I wish I had, often I would do a story, maybe a big, long, beefy magazine story, which I had the luxury of time to do. I would do the story to investigate a mystery that I wanted to solve. Like I was just very curious about it. But maybe if I had been more explicit about that to myself, right, that would have been helpful. Like, is that really what my audience needs? Is that the mystery that's consuming them? Let me give you an example. I did a piece for The Atlantic a few years ago. Why does college cost so much in America? It was a mystery to me that was very interesting. And I think to most of The Atlantic's readers, so that's good. But in doing that story, I sort of forgot that it's really important to know what narratives they have in their head, the audience, right? And it's more than one, more than a dozen. But like, let's get the top 5, okay? What are the narratives people have in their head? Now, this is tricky, right? Because you don't want to, and this is a relatively tame example, but you don't want to inadvertently validate false information by acknowledging it. But let me just tell you what I did do. So as I was working on reporting this, talking to lots of folks and looking at a lot of research, at some point I did hear the theory that, oh, college is so expensive in America because of government loans. Like free money drives up the price, right? But I looked into it and it just didn't seem to be true because there's lots of, lots of things are interacting here, but it didn't seem to be a primary cause for our exorbitant college costs because in other countries, which was my lens through which I was looking at this, they give away money too, right? And it wasn't driving up tuition to the same degree. So I just didn't address it. I gave up on that argument, right? Because it didn't seem to be true. So what do you think happened? So I do the story, I'm like all, thinking, I've really worked through a bunch of different, maybe it's this, maybe it's that, maybe it's not. Yes, it is. No, it's not. And I get just slammed by readers who are like, dummy, it's the free government money. So, on the one hand, I didn't perpetuate false information. On the other hand, what have I actually accomplished? Because I didn't even investigate that claim. So the first question for people, I think, to ask is, what is my goal with the story? If it's to validate the people in my audience who already believe a certain thing, that's one thing. If it's to try to reach different people who aren't in my audience, that's one thing, right? If it's to try to persuade, that's a whole different thing. And I would argue none of your intuition about what will persuade is right, at least speaking for myself. So let's circle back to that later. But anyway, that's the fundamental first question, right? Is like, what is our goal with this story or with this news outlet? And if it's to persuade, pause.
So it reminds me of something you write about in your book that I've thought about a lot, which is how do you make something hearable? Because it sounds like what you're saying is that for some people, if your piece about the cost of college does not acknowledge their view about the cost of college, they're going to blow it off entirely. Like if they don't feel seen by it, if they don't feel like their values and assumptions and questions and curiosities are reflected in your piece, it doesn't seem relevant to them. Is that right?
Exactly. So now there's some narratives people have in their head that we could actually acknowledge, explore with humility, right? Like this one. Like I could have said, yeah, I too have wondered which is true, if, college loans and like easy money easy money.
Yeah.
Bring up the price of college. There's a real inherent logic to that. And here's what I found, because, you know, I did that in other pieces of the story. I did say, I thought going into this that it was the lazy rivers and the ridiculous, you know, cafeterias, but no, bummer. It's not that. I was super disappointed. Here's what it seems to be. Why didn't I? Now, this is the next question. Why didn't I then allow in that other thought? I think because consciously or subconsciously, it seemed dangerous to me. Like it seemed like, oh, this is a conservative talking point designed to undercut Pell Grants.
Right. So better to just not give it air.
So, right, exactly. But I think you got to notice when you're doing that and ask the question, is this actually going to help? Is this the goal? Like, you know.
Yeah, help what?
Right. Is this going to help people not believe this thing because I didn't say it? I mean, no, to the contrary, to your point, we know from all the research on listening that when people don't feel heard, which is 89% of the time, according to research by Graham Bodie, they get louder and more extreme. So I guess one question is, which of these narratives can I at least surface and speak about and try to get other people to speak about, so that we can bring it out and people feel heard, even if I don't end there.
But your goal with that story was not to persuade people. It was to fully examine a complex issue, right?
Yeah, it was to try to literally figure this out. Like, what the heck is going on here?
Mystery, answer a curiosity.
So that we could do better. But the thing is, part of doing better requires like some consensus in the public about what is causing tuition to be so expensive, right? Because, you know, if you think it's free federal money, you're never going to support more state money going to public universities, which, by the way, is one of the reasons tuition's gotten so expensive. So it's like this circular problem.
Yeah. So we talk a lot at Trusting News about how you have to understand mistrust in order to address it. Like invest in, we just wrapped up a project with some newsrooms around what happens when you specifically reach out to people who don't trust you and talk to them about that and what they're looking for from the news. And it seems like that question of helping people feel hearable, helping people feel heard and making your content hearable is rooted in an understanding of what people think. And so when we talk about like all of the accusations flying at journalists, the attacks on journalists' credibility, and a lot of times the temptation is to tune it out. And I think there are times where we need to turn it out. Sometimes it's personal, sometimes it's abusive. You know, I certainly don't think everyone needs to be listened to, but I do also think that, and have seen with our work with newsrooms, the value of engaging enough to understand, so that you can say, you know, it hadn't even occurred to me, because they might be sharing things that you and your editors haven't considered, right? And if people say, well, I won't believe that, I won't believe this story on this topic, because they're not even going to address X, which is the real reason. So if you don't know what they think the real reason is, then you can't make that content more, you don't have any shot of making that content more credible for them. Absolutely.
And the easiest delusion for all of us to fall into as humans is thinking that we know what's driving their beliefs and their behavior. And this is true in all parts of our life, right? In romantic relationships, with kids, with strangers, we believe that we know what's in their hearts and minds. And what we know is that actually we only know a slice of that, if anything. So yeah, listening to your audience and getting to know your audience in all kinds of ways is just, I don't know how else we do this, right? But it does get tricky, right? I remember once, like years ago, talking to a good friend of mine who I like really like and respect. She's a social worker, sort of middle-aged white lady like myself, and she's funny, she's generous. And I was telling her I was starting to follow for a story, these various groups who are trying to get people to talk across the political divide and trying to see, is there any kind of story here that's interesting or surprising? And she just reacted immediately, like reflexively. She's like, well, I don't want to talk across the political divide. And I said, oh, okay. And I said, why not? And she said, because those people are racist, right? And it just broke my heart a little, because she's not a journalist, but she is a social worker and a white lady of some means. And like, if not her, then who? You know, if we're being honest, I think what most journalists want is for the world to be better. Like we do. And we don't like to say that because it feels like vulnerable and soft and like mission driven and advocacy driven in a way that at least journalists of my vintage are not comfortable with. But let's be honest about that. And if we want the world to be less racist, how do we get there? Right? And this is where we get into this persuasion question. But certainly not talking to racists is not going to make the world less racist. That doesn't mean amplifying racists, right?
No.
These are different things.
So that's a good question, because one of the things we hear back from newsreaders sometimes is that when we try to make content hearable, what we're doing is pandering.
Right.
And if we try to make, do we want to make content hearable by racists? Do we want to, one of the things we suggested, we have worked with newsrooms on after the election, is inserting context into stories, validating the idea that the election results were valid, the 2020 election, right? And so instead of just saying Trump made baseless claims about the election, we're going to insert context that backs that up. That is not going to persuade everybody. And it reminds me of, I actually saw someone join the call who is from a newsroom. I got an email a week or two ago from an editor who said, how do I respond to this person who submitted a letter to the editor about the election being stolen? Is there anything I can say? I'm not going to publish the letter. Is there anything I can say back that will make that person understand my reasons, make that person respect my decision, make that person feel respected or heard? Was kind of what was at the heart of this editor's question for me. So for people who want to delete the email or are just tempted to give up on people who won't accept something that journalists accept as basic fact, what is your advice?
Well, I'm dying to hear what you said and what they did. And I kind of wish we could just bring it up right here and like workshop it. But I think, a couple of different things. Like, first of all, anytime we think there are only two choices, we're usually missing something. So if it feels like the choices are to either pander or sever or give up on, we're probably missing an option. And it is entirely human in high conflict, which is what we're in, to do that kind of splitting where you think it's this or that, right? But that is something I've been trying to catch myself doing when it feels like either this or that, or you're even like there are no options, which it often feels like. I'm usually making a mistake because high conflict narrows your vision, literally, like you literally lose your peripheral vision. So is there a third option besides pandering or severing, giving up on someone, right? In that context, there's clearly the option of making them feel heard without agreeing with them. And I would actually prefer to do that over the phone because then I can do a loop of iterative listening and be like, it sounds like you're saying that you believe the election was stolen, and here's why you believe it. And it's incredibly frustrating to you because we are not acknowledging that. Is that right? Like I'm checking, right? To see if I got it right. It's very hard to do that in written form, which doesn't mean it's, not easier and more tempting to do it that way. And I have done it that way. I do it on Twitter, but I do it direct message all the time instead of with an audience. You want to remove the audience and you want to try to talk directly so you can keep checking your assumptions and making the people feel heard, and then they will tend to say more nuanced things. And I'm at no point agreeing with them, and people tend to know the difference, right? Mm-hmm. But that's where you get to something that might be useful to you, right? Is what else is here? And it's really hard. Like, I don't think it's an easy thing to do, but it might be worth doing once out of every, depending on how many of these letters you're getting, one out of every 3 times, right? I mean,
and maybe when their tone is respectful, or I mean, if they've gone to the trouble to submit a letter to the editor, that is a time where they still see you as a vehicle for community conversation. That might be somebody worth, as opposed to, you know, angry social media posts or angry voicemails or something that is social, especially comments, especially are it's harder to tell if someone is there in good faith. But if they're submitting a letter to the editor, they're probably there in good faith.
You can kind of tell, right? Like, at least pretty quickly, you can tell, right? If it's in good faith, if there's any modicum of, you know, anger is okay, but contempt is not, right? Frustration and sadness, great, love it. But disgust, no, much harder to work with, right? So what did you say, Joy, and what happened?
So what I said, I wanted to clarify that it was a private conversation, because our advice is almost always, if something is happening publicly, to respond. Because, you know, don't blow off public comments, because then you're letting someone else use a public space to attack your integrity, and it's worth jumping in. I didn't actually find out what happened, but I'm going to make a note to circle back and see. I mean, I think that it's worthwhile to understand. I'm really curious about how people are still reaching the conclusion that the election was unfair. So I would actually I would have genuine questions for the person, I think, at this point about, you know, what could you point to that would help me understand where you're coming from on this. But I do think, you know, explaining and be on the record about your fact check process for letters, and say, you know, here's the process we go through to, before we take ownership over something and publish it. And there are several things in your letter that I wouldn't get into point by point, but I would say there are several things here that don't meet our standards. And I am, you know, acknowledging how that probably makes them feel, but keep it pretty brief.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. So you're also being honest and transparent and like clear about your own boundaries in that conversation. Right. And I would just say, like, if you loop the person first, that's probably going to go a lot better.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because half of what people want is to be heard.
Yeah.
And they almost never get it. So, you know, when I worked at Time Magazine for 10 years, I remember maybe I'd been there for 6 months. And at the time, you know, this was in like the early 2000s, we had 4 million subscribers, right? This was like the glory days of print magazines. And I hadn't gotten any letters to the editor. And I thought that was weird, right? Because when I worked at Washington City paper and alti, you know, fringe radical paper in Washington, D.C., I got letters to the editor. And so I asked someone, you know, how do you get letters to the editor here? Like, how does that, because it's in Rockefeller Center, it's a huge machine. I have no idea what's what. And it was an editor I asked, and he said, I'll never forget it. He said, why would you want to read those?
Yeah.
And then he said, but if you really want to know, it's there's a letters department. It's on another floor. Not really sure where.
I mean, I guess you could talk to them if you want to. Maybe they could show you something. I mean, but the question is, just to keep this mired in the murky, troublesome middle, not easy answers. The journalists who opt into working with us, who come to your workshops, who show up for something like this, they're not anti-engagement in general. It's not that they don't want to hear from the audience, right? It's that they're trying to say, what in the world can I say back, and should I bother trying to say back to people who are attacking our election coverage because they say it's not valid?
I guess why that's relevant to me is that the backstory here of how traditional journalism at the national level treated readers is relevant to how that distrust grew and how those organizations left the door open for Fox News and other propaganda channels, right? Now, that doesn't mean it's their fault, doesn't mean it's that editor's fault at the time, right? But it's like a piece of how we got here.
Yeah, when I talked about inserting, kind of backing up the election, the concept that the elections are fair, when I pitched that idea to a major national newspaper, they said, oh no, we would never do that. So, okay, so that's the idea, that it's like done. We're not going to worry about it. We're going to quit explaining it. We're just going to move on, which then cuts out anybody who doesn't still agree.
Yeah, I wish that worked. I mean, that would be fucking awesome, right? Wouldn't it be? Like, if you could just not say things that aren't true and therefore no one would believe them. Like, but I think this is where, like, you know, David Bornstein articulated this for me really well the other day, where he said, you know, the journalist theory of change is that if we can just put scary, frightening news in front of people 24/7, then things will change, like things will get better. And And what he's saying is the theory of change has to evolve for reality.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that means we can't just tell people things, say things or not say things, and then wait for the accountability to rain down. That's not going to happen.
So let's talk for a minute about how journalism makes people feel, and how, which I know is something you've thought a lot about, and how people feel that their lives are or are not reflected by journalists. We've been talking about on our team, I think Patrick might be here, one of our research partners, he talks a lot about an ethic of care within journalism. And I think that most journalists would say that their goal is to respect people and their stories and to be a constructive influence, right? But then on the other hand, a lot of when journalists call out things that aren't true or shine a light on things that seem extreme, sometimes it is done with a tone of mockery. Sometimes journalism leaves people feeling shamed or leaves people feeling humiliated, which, as you say in your book, that doesn't ever change someone's mind. Like, humiliation is not a tactic that's actually going to change anyone's mind. And by change anyone's mind, I guess I just want to reiterate, we're not here to change people's mind about the things like about the cost of college. We're here to change people's mind about whether the news is credible. That's what I have in my mind when I say that. So how do people disinclined to trust the news feel about how they and their values and people like them are reflected by the news?
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned the word humiliation, and I just want to just dwell on that for a minute, because I think something I did not understand in my own journalism career was how important dignity is as a sort of biological thing that humans need, and violations to dignity, disrespect or humiliation or being ignored, not mattering, those things drive a lot of seemingly irrational behavior. And it's probably the most underreported, underappreciated engine driving toxic divisions in the world today is humiliation, right? So what's the opposite of humiliation is dignity, right? And dignity is sort of important for journalism, right? Because the way we show people that they have dignity is by treating them like they matter, like they have value. And I think there's different ways to do that, and we should break it into chunks, right? Sometimes it's with the sources you interview, and sometimes it's with the audience, right? How you treat the audience and their beliefs, which you have to listen to them to know what they are, right? Which you already said. So, but I think one of the ways that I find really helpful to grapple with this myself, how to show people respect, how to make them feel like they've been heard without making things worse or amplifying disinformation or harming someone else, right? And so one of the places I recently went to that was really helpful is I've been talking a lot to physicians who train other physicians about how to talk to patients about bad news. Like, they're going to die, for example, right? So I recently interviewed a doctor named Robert Arnold at the University of Pittsburgh, who's done a lot of this. And it was totally fascinating, the analogies with journalism. It's not the same, right? But physicians also believe that if they could just tell you the facts, get the diagnosis right, which is hard, right? And explain it to you in words you can more or less understand, then you will hear it. And that is not working. And just like it's not always working for us, right? So I asked him, what do you do? And he said, well, the first thing you do is let go of the belief that facts change people's minds. Like if you all are still believing that, like, I'm sorry, but that's just not, especially when there's emotion involved and values involved and there's entrenched division like we have. So then, the first thing he trains people to do, right, is to listen to the patient to see what their narratives already are. And so the way that he does that is to ask the patient, what have you been told so far? Like he's trying to get a sense in real time of what's on their mind.
What the situation is, right? Like what conversation is he in, right?
Yeah. And then adjusting what he's saying next about their, say, terminal diagnosis or whatever, based on how they've responded, because they are telling him what they want and need. And he's trying to show them the dignity of listening first, right? So you can take this too far, but what was interesting was at no point did he say, well, some patients we just give up on. Now, do doctors give up on patients? 100%. We know some doctors give up on some patients, right? But that is not, there's no argument for that among people who do this work, right, at his level. Like, so it's not, and interestingly, another quick analogy, and then I'll stop talking about this, is that patients all the time bring them fake news and disinformation. Right. Like all the time. They're like, but wait, I read about this trial on Google and you are not telling me the truth and blah, blah, blah. And at no point are they trained to just sever, right? Now, sometimes they have to, if the patient's physically threatening or other things, right? And same with journalists. But that's not, like, part of what he's trying to do is build rapport, earn rapport, and then use rapport to try to communicate.
Mm-hmm. And not make that person feel like they're stupid for believing the thing they found on Google.
Right, because it just doesn't work.
So you can respond to the person. Yeah, well, you could respond to the person who submits the letter to the editor saying, no, everybody knows, everybody reasonable knows that the election was fair. Bye-bye, right? Right. Which is,
but I mean, that kind of response, we know now, that kind of, like, whether it's mockery, disrespect, humiliation, especially if there's an audience, right? So over social media or in a story, it leads people to feel what is called in the research social pain. And it lights up the part of the brain that lights up when you get electrocuted, right? It's the same. So when people feel excluded, even if they're wrong, and they should feel excluded, it causes unbearable pain. And it's really easy to do in experiments. There's been like 500 experiments on this all over the world. And it takes like 3 minutes to do it. You can do it online, you can do it in person. It's really easy. And people don't react well. They start at first by trying to re-ingratiate themselves if it's in person, and then they become aggressive and withdrawn. So do we want our readers to become withdrawn and aggressive? Probably not, if we can avoid it. So that, I think that research, as Nelson Mandela put it, there's no one more dangerous than one who's been humiliated, even if you humiliate him rightly. I think that last part's really important.
So it seems like, so this takes a lot of work. And let me just say that there is a difference between the journalism most of us do day to day and a long magazine piece about the cost of college, right, where you have room to get into things, right? And so I just want to say that one thing we work on a lot at Trusting News is how you get on the record about your approach to covering something and then do it efficiently so you can link back to it a bunch. Like you could have an FAQ about your approach to covering the election and say, our role here, for example, is to help you understand how our local election infrastructure works and who the people are behind it and why the local elected officials and government employees, why they trust it and what they point to. We're happy to take questions, but here's the set of facts that we've settled on here, and then you have something, if you do that once, that doesn't make everyone like it, but at least you're on the record about where you're coming from, and then you can link back to it repeatedly.
I see. So you're saying create reusable, transparent
explanations, reusable transparency,
why we're doing what we're doing, and be thoughtful about which signposts. I think, why are we explaining one thing but not another if it's on a lot of readers' minds? I think that's an easy trap too to fall into. Like the other day, I was being interviewed for an NPR show, and the booker sent me an email, the usual technical details, and then there was an attachment, and it was a explanation of NPR's policy on pronouns, and it was 6 pages long. And I was like, wow. Now, are there other policies on other things? Why is it 6 pages? It just, for me, opened up a bunch of questions. So anyway, that's just something to think about, is what are the things you're not explaining that your readers might be wondering about?
Yeah. Are you taking time to explain the things that people are most curious about? And if you exclude people, if they don't feel seen by that, then if you exclude people from, if you say like sort of, here's what it means to be reasonable and you're not one of us, and you do that carelessly, then why would they ever come back.
Right. I mean, I haven't even gone on the show. I'm already like, wait, what's happening here,
Yeah.
and I'm actually not in disagreement with it, but I still was like, this is very overwrought in ways that are interesting.
Okay, so we are going to open up to questions in a minute. My colleague Lynn Walsh is hanging out in the chat and will feed us questions, or you're also welcome to unmute yourself in a minute and ask a question. Let me first get to one more thing, which is I would love to grapple for a moment with how you can tell if somebody is reachable, how you can tell whether they're, can we just talk about how hard that can be to tell whether someone is reachable? And sometimes it's, so for example, let's talk about something our newsroom partners have been hearing a lot lately when Patrick and Sue, our research partners who are here, when they were analyzing what our newsroom partners heard when they reached out to people who didn't trust the news, they heard really different things depending on who those folks were and their reasons for not trusting the news. But one theme that was real troubling that we've heard a lot is for some people who lean right, especially, coverage of things that are seen as social justice issue, racial justice, LGBTQ issues, any coverage of those things feels like a sign of wokeness, feels like a sign of a progressive bent, and they just see a headline. It's not even about how the story is done. They see a headline, and that is a sign that the news outlet leans left and has lost their trust. And so in some cases, that might be people worth engaging with, who have limited exposure to things, who if you understand, we worked with newsrooms on things like, explaining we have a really diverse community. We're trying to, it's our job as a public service oriented organization to cover the diversity of that community. We understand we might cover things that you don't see in your daily life, but other people don't, whatever. You can explain that and why you cover those things and what your goals are, or they might just be really bigoted and not worth your time, right? So how do you know?
Now, are you asking me or everybody else?
I'm asking you, and then we're going to open it up.
Darn. I mean, some people, I think it's pretty obvious just based on how they're coming at you. And then some, like just, the level of aggression and performance, depending on the context. And then other people, I mean, I think the thing that I have, I mean, again, I have to go to people who are smarter about conflict than I am to answer this, but, one of the things I talk a lot about in my own work are the presence of conflict entrepreneurs. So there are these people and companies who exploit conflict for their own ends, right? Who really delight in conflict. Pundits, sometimes journalists, sometimes, social media platforms, sometimes people in your life. We probably all know someone like this. And it's really important to identify who they are, to try not to be a conflict entrepreneur, right? And then my big advice in the book was to distance yourself from conflict entrepreneurs. Because everyone I followed who shifted out of like malignant conflict, that's what they did. And a bunch of people wrote to me and were like, okay, thanks. What if I can't distance myself from a conflict entrepreneur? What if I can't give up on them, right? And so I was like, man, that's true. That's, what if they're your boss or your president or your husband or whatever? And so I did the one trick I have, which is, report it out. And I reached out to Gary Friedman, who is featured in my book as a conflict expert who got caught up in conflict himself. And he said, well, if they're 90% conflict entrepreneur, see if you can reach the 10%. So what does that mean? That means you have to engage a little bit. And sometimes the best way to find out if someone is reachable is to literally ask them. I think this is a little bit counterintuitive for us, but I've started trying it. And it often looks like it's pretty simple. It's like, I would like to talk to you about this, but I want to do it in a different way. Like, are you open to that? And they might not be. And when Gary was advising a school superintendent who was on my podcast about this, because the superintendent was having a lot of conflict with the union president. And he said to him, invite her to the table. Do you want to do this differently? Because I really do. And she may say no. But you know what? You can make the invitation again 6 months later. because in a lot of conflicts, unfortunately, and I would include our political conflict, things are going to have to get worse before they get better. But you can keep making the invitation and see how they respond.
So could you actually say that as a journalist, if somebody's attacking your integrity, say, I'm actually really happy to engage with you about that and explain how I operate and explain why I stand behind what I report. Are you open to hearing that? Like, is that what you say? Is that the question? Are you open to hearing it, or are you open? Will it make a difference?
I would actually go back in that sentence if I were line editing it, Joy, if you would permit me. And I would take out happy. Never lie to someone about your willingness to.
Oh, yeah, I don't actually want to hear.
At no point, Joy, are you like, I'd be happy, I'd be delighted. Like you're not, they know that you wouldn't be happy, right?
I'm willing.
You would do it.
Yeah, I will discuss this with you if
yeah, I want to discuss this with you because I'm curious about what's behind this and what I can learn from talking to you. And I want you to hear what's behind my decisions. And I want to do it in such a way that like we can both keep our like dignity intact. Are you willing to try to do that with me? And what would that look like for you? Wow. Man, maybe that's too squishy for people. Like maybe you have to adjust it for your own like vernacular, but it's a question. Anytime people are in conflict, ask a question. That's a great way to get them to think,
Awesome. Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to switch the view here so that we can see everybody. Hello, folks. And Lynn, what should we respond to in the comments?
Yeah, I think there's a question that relates directly to this kind of idea of when someone is sort of aggressive that you're talking to and how to respond. And so Brittany makes a point, and she says, I'd love to hear Amanda's thoughts on how much emotional resiliency is needed for someone to practice this. It exhausts me to think about constantly engaging in these conversations. And then Anne builds off of what Brittany says and says, the whole burnout and harassment, especially of young journalists, is a serious concern with some of this work.
Yeah. I had a journalist say to me this week that she was starting to, based on the vitriol and the comments coming back, getting more and more concerned about her staff who just what kind of situations they're putting themselves in and what they might be opening themselves up to, especially in person and especially with younger staffs. So it's both protecting ourselves and the emotional resilience, even if we can take it, like what does that take out of us and how much should we put into it?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, I think the word constantly is an important one in that question. Brady says constantly engaging, like probably that's too much, right? Like anything, you want to dose it. And you also want to practice it. I think this is something that we don't do enough of, maybe because we don't have time, but also because I think it feels kind of like woo woo, but you got to practice high stress interactions in a low stakes setting. I mean, that's why Navy SEALs practice with role play and CIA agents and why conflict mediators do it. And so should journalists. So one of the things that Helene and I do at Good Conflict is practice the looping listening strategy, because I can say, speaking for myself, once it becomes automatic, like there's muscle memory, it's so much less draining. Like it doesn't take as much away and I can just do it without thinking. But it's taken me a lot of practice in low stakes settings to do that, including practicing with your kid is a great way to practice. Practicing with your friends, I do it in every interview, but you really got to get that to a level of automatic so that it's not so draining. Yeah.
But give yourself permission too to step away when it either becomes too much for you. I had to just cut off a cab driver last week because he was spewing. I engaged with him for like 10 or 15 minutes. Then I was like, I'm just going to go back to my book.
Yes.
That was just me personally being tired of it, right? It wasn't.
Well, and what are you going to, where does this
became clear, we're not going anywhere, right?
Right.
But that's different than when somebody feels personally attacked based on their identity, where they feel like they might actually be in a situation they can't control or are sort of nervous about it. Like it's completely different, right?
Totally. And I think what I've learned is the more I practice in a safe and low stakes setting, engaging in these kinds of conversations, the less I feel threatened. So in other words, I think in high conflict, we get activated in ways that we have evolved to respond as if something is a physical threat. Like it very much feels like a physical threat. And sometimes it is, but I would argue it's a smaller percentage than it feels. And so if you're trying to close the gap between what's a real threat and what feels like a threat, practice is again, and yeah, containing it, choosing your battles, not doing it all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, the success, the reputation of your journalism and your brand and whatever, it's not going to hinge on one interaction. And you know, stepping away when you need to step away, I think is really important.
There's one other question kind of building off of this that I think is important to kind of hear your thoughts on, Amanda. The question is, do you suggest talking individually with people like this if they seem possibly reachable? And then part two is it important to keep journalists safe who are part of marginalized groups in talking with someone like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, that feels like an easy one. So yes, it's important to keep journalists safe who are part of marginalized groups. Yes, it is. And again, the more you practice, the safer you will be and the more able you will be to assess when it's not a good situation for you and you need to shut it down or ask for help or get somebody else to take it. I think it's very hard to do that without practice. But anyway, the other thing I would just say is so one of the most diabolical things about this level of conflict that we're in is that any intuitive thing you do to try to make it better will almost certainly make it worse. And in the context of this conversation, that means you have to do counterintuitive things, which takes practice, right? And one counterintuitive thing that you might want to consider, I don't know, but I'm just going to throw it out there. You know, you mentioned somebody had written, like, it was an editor saying that, you know, they're worried about their staff. I think Joy mentioned that. Sometimes when we're under attack, our instinct, our intuition is to wall up, to never let them see you sweat, to get very stoic and certain and convicted. And in fact, that makes you easier to dehumanize. So it's totally effed up, right? But if you can find a way to reveal like 10% of your actual vulnerability, to be like, you know, whether you're the editor writing a letter to, you know, from the editor, or whether you're talking to someone. And to answer that other question, yeah, I do think it's better to engage with people one-on-one without an audience than like at an event or on social media. If they seem like they might be open to having, to following some ground rules in the conversation. But when you do that, think about saying what you just said, right? Like, I'm really worried about my staff. Here's some of the things they're hearing. You know, some of them are like 24 years old. They're working 50, 60 hours a week. Like, it is hard to do that unless you're prepared in advance. But if you do it, you rehumanize yourself, which makes it harder for people to use you as a target of convenience, because that's what's happening here. Like, let me just be clear. We are all being used as a target of convenience because there's a lot of anxiety and misery and pain and anger in the air. And the media is a very easy target. So what you want to do is not be a robot. You want to be a human. And that is hard to do when you feel threatened, right? So you got to prepare what you're going to say to make yourself vulnerable in advance. But you don't want to make their job easy for them, right? If they're out to just scapegoat you and blame you and demonize you, just make it 10% harder.
Yeah, Sue just shared in the chat that with the research she just helped us do, there were conversations with people who seemed really vitriolic about journalism all the way to the end. But then when they took a follow-up survey, actually their opinions about journalism had evolved, and some trust was built just through having the interaction. So I would love to hear from more folks here about, I'm happy to still take questions also for Amanda, but I'm also interested in hearing from folks about what's worked for you. How does this show up in your work? How do you respond in ways that feel productive, or how do you decide when to step away? I'd welcome anyone to unmute and jump in.
I'll jump in. I'm a physician writer person. Hi, Joy. And I met Amanda at our Citizens Climate Lobby meeting, and she took a picture with me. So I'm thrilled to be on this. So I'm a physician, and I recently wrote for the Conversation platform, and I did it on daylight saving time because I support permanent standard time, and I've testified to Congress on this and stuff. And it was interesting because I was told respond to all these comments, right, when they come in. And some of them started being a little nasty. I mean, it's not that controversial, but some people were very opinionated. And what I tried to do, and I think it was the right approach, is I was like, you make a really good point. I never thought of it that way. And then I would kind of inject the truth. But I always kind of started out with, that's really interesting. And that's a really interesting perspective. And then I would put in, clarify why I thought their position was not correct, but I did it in a very careful way. And it was good because I felt like they weren't as angry when they responded to me. It was just very interesting watching the interaction. But I'm curious because it is kind of like a fine line, right, between responding to get the temperature down, but not going so far that people misinterpret your words, right?
That you validate what they're saying, or that you give a bunch of oxygen to something that is not needed, or that you take a personal toll or invest all this time thinking you're gonna persuade them. Yeah, that's good. I mean, that simple kind of interpersonal feedback seems really smart, although it does also remind me of what Amanda said, which is people can tell if you're lying. So especially if you're on the phone. Is it interesting? Right?
Yeah. It had to be genuine. I agree. And sometimes I had to step away, like you're saying, and come back to it later, like sort of when you draft an email, but you don't send it right away, right? I just kind of had to step away and then say, I'm not ready to send this right now.
Thank you, Beth. Who else?
I'd love to just amplify that last point of, the email that you write but not send. And I think it goes back to one of Amanda's precepts in the high conflict book is slow it down, right? When there's conflict, slow down. And that's a hard thing to do, I imagine, in newsrooms where things go very fast. But you don't have to respond to that email. If you respond to it 4 months out and say, I read your email, but I couldn't respond because I just wasn't in the right place then, or it made me really angry. Again, being human, they're still going to want to hear it probably 4 months later. It doesn't all have to happen right away.
Thank you, Mary. And Mary's one of the mediators that I've learned from, and I think that's really wise advice. And what I like is how you also put in a little humanity in there by revealing, I was just too upset to respond to this at first. Now I feel like I can. Like you're showing yourself in a way that journalists very rarely do, right?
I think it's okay too to respond being frustrated about the accusations. Like you can say, that's really frustrating for me to hear because I see how hard the staff works. I watched the reporters last night, work for hours trying to verify this, and we didn't publish until they had this many sources confirmed, or whatever it is. I think people understand defending your friends and defending your people and defending your own integrity. Anybody would defend their own integrity. And so I think if you're willing to say, sometimes it could be beneficial to have emotion in response to that, not just sort of cold defensiveness.
Yeah, right. Aloofness, right?
I'd like to bring up some of my just lived experience. I grew up very conservative, and so I've been on the side of the people that you're talking about. And I just think it would do every journalist a lot of good to really try to step in their world of what would it be like to try to unlearn how you grew up, and what would it be like to seek that learning. I had to have really thick skin and be really really bold and brave to go out on a limb and be in spaces where I didn't feel safe. And I would say more than half of the time, like my honest questions were, I mean, I was humiliated for them, and I was criticized, and people weren't really wanting, like, just like, why are you wasting my time? And so I think understanding that the people that are being really aggressive and confrontational, there's a reason they have that, and that they're experiencing the same thing that you all are experiencing. And so that type of just understanding of we're all in the mud. And so definitely, I mean, there's so many points I would love to address, but what you're saying about just that humanity and just saying, okay, I'm going to do it differently. I am going to suppress my fight or flight response, my fight back response, and I'm going to just be vulnerable and treat you human, despite how, like, I want to vomit by what you think.
Oh my gosh, that was awesome. I feel like you're just telling that story is more powerful than anything I could say. So, and it reminds me of one really good way to reach people or to not give up on people, in addition to listening, right? Like we just did, is also like amplifying the voices of people who have been through change. And so, like, instead of the righteous source, find the changed source. Because in high conflict, we make the mistake of thinking the other side will never change. And that's when you give up on people. And that's when the only good choice is annihilation. But in fact, people do change. I've changed my minds about many, many things. You have too, right? And that's really interesting and fascinating, especially in a time of high conflict. So I think stories like the one you just told, and finding sources, and all you have to do is ask different questions, right? And really listen in a way that builds trust, right? I mean, I'm not going to reveal how I changed my mind to the people who most hate me on Twitter. Like, that's not going to happen. But if someone seems to be genuinely listening to me, I will reveal a lot about my own mistakes in the past, you know, and that's what we're missing, right? That kind of humility, that kind of grace, that kind of sense of movement and fluidity. So thank you for sharing that.
Well, and one of the things, just to add on like what you're saying, is there's lots of people out there that are really trying to figure it out, but they're not the ones to write the editor. They're not the ones to talk, but they're listening. And so there's a community organizer that I've learned a lot from, and he said, don't give up on talking to the people that you know will never change their mind, because you're not trying to convince them, you're trying to convince the people that are listening. And how you behave in those really aggressive, really hard conversations, even if by the end you say, okay, well, this conversation's done. There are people reading those posts, they're listening, and they're paying attention to how each of you are treating the humanity. And if they're on the side of the really aggressive person, that's causing so much important cognitive dissonance of, wait a minute, this person I trust is being really unfair, actually, even though I agree with what they're saying. And this person is being human. Like it hits at in really important change-making things.
That is such a great point. Like, you're showing, not telling, right? Show, don't tell. And so there's a secondary audience for a lot of this. And maybe that audience is the most important one.
The persuadable audience, the reachable audience, and you can't always tell who that is, but they're probably listening.
Right.
Definitely listening.
Yeah.
I mean, part of how we got into this hellfire we're in is by national media, TV media modeling the opposite, right? So part of how we get out is by modeling something else. Like, what does that look like?
And talking about how we're modeling something else so that
And
people
being
notice
explicit.
it. Being explicit about what we're trying to do. Yep.
Yeah.
So our hour is up.
Oh,
Thank you
shoot.
so much. Amanda, that's it. Any final words, Amanda, or any links you want to share or anything you want to send people to?
No, I just wanted to hear more from everyone. So I'm sorry I talked so much, but I'm grateful to have been part of the conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for making the time. Thank you everyone for coming. This is part of an initiative we have at Trusting News called A Road to Pluralism, where we are working real hard to understand how people approach the news and how journalists can respond to the different values and mindsets people bring to the news. And we also, so you can find out more about how to get involved with us there through the link that Lynn just shared in the chat. It's great to see everyone. Thank you so much for your time. Amanda, thank you.